You're listening to Dropping Pins, a story-based learning series from the OK as Hunter podcast, hosted by Derek Melkor, and aimed at helping you hone your whitetail hunting skills. You'll hear the aha moments when known and unknown proven whitetail killers started consistently putting mature bucks on the ground.
All right, good morning, podcast land. Derek here from Dropping Pins and OK as Hunter podcast. We're here in the morning, so instead of our normal bourbon or scotch, I got the cup of coffee. My buddy Brian Douglas is our guest today. He was willing to jump on in the morning here. We both got kids at home, and he's headed to work in a little bit, so I appreciate him making the effort to jump on this morning. If you have not heard of Brian or any of the work that he does, let me introduce him for you. Brian is an absolute killer, the dink slayer, as he calls it, but really, Brian is a mature buck slayer. He hails from Illinois and has been hunting public land for most of his life. He is the creator and the brain behind Good Sit Mobile, which he's got an awesome YouTube channel. I've got it up in the back here, and you probably can barely see it, but what you'll see is thumbnail after thumbnail of big, beautiful, giant, mature public land bucks. Brian is a self-filmer. He does all the editing, video production, and filming himself. Definitely go check out his channel, Good Sit Mobile on YouTube. He has some awesome hunts. I've just gone through and rewatched all of them for the second time. So you're going to see some great hunts. You'll learn a lot from those videos, which again is our goal here today with the podcast. And Brian also develops his own mobile hunting products. And at first he kind of just did that to make his life a little bit more effective and hunting a little bit easier. And now he's been generous enough to share those with the public. So goodsitmobile.com. Brian's got all kinds of stuff from hunting rig stuff, how to set up your stand, sticks, carry things in, to some really great camera mounts and trail camera mounts. So he is totally engulfed in the whitetail hunting, which is why we wanted to get him on here. Not only is he engulfed in it, thinks about it all the time. He just was explaining he did a couple miles yesterday in the heat, buggy, just vegetative infected woods. He's eating, breathing, living it. And he is a very, very effective hunter. So we wanted to get him on the Dropping Pins to hear a couple things about what has helped him click on these bucks, what has helped him develop his process over the years, and a few stories that hopefully we can pull some information from. So welcome to the show, Brian. It's great to have you. Thanks for jumping on with me this morning.
Thanks, buddy. Thanks for that very lengthy and awesome pre-interview about me, making me seem super cool. So I'm really not that cool.
Yeah, as you can see, he's got his name as Dink Slayer on there. Very humble guy. But I like to introduce whoever I got on, because it's hard to talk about yourself and sell yourself, even though you're a salesman. So I just want to give you the credit where the credit's due. And if you guys go check out Brian's YouTube, you'll see right away what I'm talking about. He gets it done, not only on finding big bucks, but just your killer instinct and what you're doing in the tree stand to be ready. If you guys go watch some of these cell phone videos, 99% of guys are not as ready to make the shot happen as Brian is. And I think that's one of the big takeaways I took from watching your videos. But we'll leave the videos to another end here. I know you've got a couple stories. So on Dropping Pins, our main goal is to hear some stories from big buck killers that help them kind of put the pieces together, or gave them a little bit of a moment of clarity or epiphany of like, holy crap, this is what's going on. I need to use this in future strategies. So I'd just like to turn the floor over to you. But before you get into a story, I'd love our listeners to hear a little bit about just maybe what kind of terrain you grew up hunting, or what kind of terrain you found success in. Is it public? Is it private? I've mentioned public a little bit, but just a little bit of backstory on the terrain. And then I'd love to jump right into some story you got for us.
Yeah. So it's mainly hills, roughly 400 to 750, 800 foot elevation. And then you have mixed in CRP, or just, like overgrown clear cuts and stuff like that, mixed in with a lot of ag. And so I kind of grew up in the perfect combination of habitat for whitetails. So I think that has helped me to become better, in the sense that I've gotten to see a lot more whitetail habits and just what they do, when you're in good habitat compared to guys that don't get as many at bats. So I think that me being able to screw it up over and over again in good habitat has ultimately made me a better hunter. So
That's fantastic. That's something that I was recording an episode last night with two of my buddies from central northern Wisconsin. And one of the things we talked about is just one of the detriments to the area we hunt, which is mainly solid forest in the northern part of the state, is the visibility aspect and how big of a role that plays. Where if you've got crop fields and sometimes CRP that's small enough where you can observe deer from a distance, how big of a, an advantage that can be. So I'm kind of glad you pointed that out this morning.
well, what's crazy is when I think back on a large amount of at least the bedding areas that I focused in on, it started with visuals on deer. And then, from there, the scouting and the trail cams and all that stuff took over. So, and that's kind of where what my story is going to start. And then, you'll hear some of that throughout there too.
Excellent. So, we'd love to hear whatever story you're willing to share, and then we can definitely talk about. I'd love to hear what realizations you kind of came to afterward, and how that kind of affected your process going from there on out. And I'll interject with some thoughts if need be. Otherwise, we want to hear from you. So, if you're ready, Brian, I'd love to fire away on whatever story it is you'd like to share. I'd love to hear it.
So, basically, my very first bow hunt ever is kind of where this story starts. And I set up a ladder stand not too far from the road, and had an encounter with a doe, and a lot of crazy stuff happened. But when I came out that first morning, I remember looking back, way back, and seeing a couple of bucks standing way in the back. And I thought, okay, well, there's where the bucks are. But it didn't click right there that I needed to chase the bucks. So I still just hunted the same stands for a long time, and kind of took my lumps on learning and understanding deer behavior. But ultimately, eventually, as I would progress in life, I would go back there, and then from there, I remember coming out and seeing bucks back in this other field, even further back. So by the time I realized, okay, I need to go after and figure this out, I'm making 1.2 mile walk back into this area. And I started hunting this field. And back in the day on public that I was hunting, you could actually get deer coming out on the field and almost have natural movement out on the fields because it wasn't as pressured as what it is today. But one day I got in late. I had been going in there, and I'd had multiple encounters, and I decided to circle around the back of this field through the bedding area. And since I got there late, I was bringing a decoy in there in a bucket, and I was going to set this field where it pinched down, where I'd almost shot an 8-pointer. And anyway, I get down
Is this in the morning or in the afternoon, Brian?
At this time, it was the afternoon because these deer were coming out regularly on this field. And I'd had big buck encounter. I'd almost shot an 8-pointer, a big 8 at like 30 yards going through this pinch. And this is back when I still didn't fully understand that hunting public was different than hunting private in how, if you want to be consistently successful. So I'm still trying to do what the Drurys and everybody is doing, and that's hunting field edges. And back at that time, it was kind of mucking up the waters for me because it was working kind of, you know what I mean? But it still wouldn't have been the most effective way to do it.
It was giving you a little bit of false hope because you could still make some visuals. Some bucks were hitting the field in daylight, made you feel like you were doing the right thing. But what now, you're saying,
yeah. Now
more successful if you were.
What I know to be consistent now, like that was just when you're hunting a field edge too, you're just more hoping and praying that they walk by you, right? And a lot of the times you have so many eyes to defeat with the does and stuff, and especially on public, and then you got wind, swirling winds and stuff like that. You just don't have the advantage on the field. And I had a cousin who was really successful during the rut. I should say really successful. He had 2 or 3 different bucks that he killed, taking decoys out and shooting them at first light, on fields. And so, and I'd helped him drag a couple. So my thought was, I'm going to take this decoy and set up on the bucket where I was, but I'm going to draw them in, to me. But when I got there, they had been coming out regularly at a certain time. And I decided that rather than go up and try to booger them up, I was going to make this long circle through this ditch and I was going to try to come up as close as I could to the corner and set up and then try and rattle. Well, I didn't realize that I had taken a ditch over from the one that I wanted to be that was right by the field. I went an extra ditch over. Okay. Now looking back, I was on a secondary ridge, bedding ridge, which is awesome, especially during the rut. So, but I go down into this bottom and I thought, man, I don't want to pop up onto near that field and spook everything off. So I'm going to set down here in the bottom up against a tree, and I'm going to set up my, my decoy right here, and I'm going to rattle. And I do that. I set up, I get all set up, and immediately a 10-pointer comes in right coming from this bedding point, comes in right to me, like face level. As soon as I see him, I'm drawn and I'm waiting. He's slightly quartering to, all of his attention is on the decoy right there in this bottom. It's not, the funny thing is too, is any professional wouldn't tell you to do it, put a decoy down in a brushy bottom, or like it was like you could still see, but at the same time, you would want to be on a more open field or in some CRP or something like that. And here I am sitting on a bucket with a decoy, and this buck comes in like he read the script. Yeah. So obviously I wait, and I thought it was perfect, but he was slightly quartering to. I hammer him, and I thought it was perfect, just behind the shoulder. The deer ran up. Now, knowing what I know now, the way he acted, I would have just backed out and came in back in there the next day. But I was young and ambitious, and I pushed right in thinking the deer was dead. We pushed him all night and never did find the deer. So,
dang it.
But the one positive that came out of that whole thing there is that bedding point. I had remembered it, that's where that deer had come off of. And so really, I just tell that story to set up to me finding this spot that I ended up calling the honeyhole. Okay. So there's multiple bucks that are intertwined with this bedding area, but I went back in there. I can't remember, a few years later, and I remember going up on the top of the point where he came off of and seeing some scrapes in there. And I was like, well, he came from back in. Go ahead.
I just wanted to ask you a real quick question, just to, I'm a very much of a visual learner, so I just want to make sure I've got this pictured right in my head and for anybody listening. So it sounds like your field is up on top
Yep.
field that you were originally planning. You circled down through a bottom, and then when you rattled with that decoy, he came off the ridge slightly above you. Is this the top of the field, or is he somewhere down a little bit lower on the bridge? Did he come in from above you to the bottom?
So the ridges are almost the same height. The field is slightly higher than these other ridges. I mean, once you get all the way to the top, the tops are going to be the same, but some of these ridges, they start to slope off. So you're kind of below where those fields would be. And I was, okay. So basically there's a hill in between me and then another ditch and then the field. Okay. And I had went down this one, and I'm on this offside, and it goes out to a long point, but then it also curls around to another point. So it's kind of a point off of a point. And
perfect.
Yeah. And it also has a horse trail that goes along the top of it. And but it ends at the very end of the point. So I often think that a lot of people just don't want to be hunting that close to like me and you talked about the other night. I think people, like with roads and anything where people are walking or driving, people want to get away from those. But a lot of the times, if they don't have the pressure, they're still pretty good. So, but I went up. I don't remember exactly how many years later, but I'd always remembered that spot in the back of my mind. So I went in to kind of dissect what was going on and found some scrapes on there, like further from where he came, but just where the bedding point started to slope off. But it was right up on that little tabletop right there, where it had like some kind of shit crap trees like locust and hedge and stuff like that. And then as you start sloping down the hill, you start getting some different thick stuff and different kind of trees and oaks and stuff like that. And so I had kept that in the back of my mind. And back then I used to set permanent stands. So I was like, well, at some point I need to get a permanent stand in there. So I go in there to hang a permanent stand, and I started getting soaked. right? So because it started raining on me when I hung this permanent stand. And I was going to hunt it that afternoon. And I decided, you know what? Shotgun is in 2 days. So what I'm going to do is drive around this public area and look for any kind of inclination of deer feeling safe in an area so then I can focus in on that. And so I drive around, and then right in the area, right by where all the people camp and like the ranger station and stuff like that, I see a bunch of, or I see like 2 or 3 nice bucks, one good one, couple nice ones out there dogging does, and there's like 10 deer. And I'm like, all these people are driving by and they're not paying them any attention. You know, they're only a couple 100 yards out in these open fields. And I thought, well, shit. I said, they feel comfortable out there even after all this hunting pressure. I said, I got to go just lay down in some of that grass out there and see what happens on opening day of shotgun. And sure enough, it's really windy. I laid there all morning. And then I came back out, and then I went back out, and about 3 in the afternoon, I hear gunshots about 500 yards away. And I see a big 8-pointer running from the gunshots. And I'm like, well, that's cool that they're moving, you know? And then all of a sudden I'm scanning, and he pops up 100 yards on my field looking right towards me. And I'm standing in just this tall grass with my shooting stick. And this dude makes a beeline straight at me, and I shoot him at 30 yards, and he runs and dies in the grass right by me. Yeah. And this is a 140-inch 8-pointer. So, and
that's a beauty.
It was crazy. And so me and my uncle comes and helps me drag it out the easiest way, which is to the road, but it's away from the truck. And this truck full of guys who'd been out hunting in the wind, it was really, really windy and cold. They come driving by, and I flag them down and go, hey guys, can you guys take me over to my truck over here? And I said, I got this buck. And they look back and they go, we've been out in the middle of freaking nowhere hunting all day in this wind, and you shoot this dude right by where we're sleeping tonight. And I was like, hey man, I was like, you know, I just got lucky. How's that? And so anyway, we're laughing, you know, and they drop me off and we get him out. And I didn't hunt that other stand that year. I'd killed that buck and totally, you know, and it actually was years before I made it back in there, other than getting that stand. I went and got the stand that year, but I hadn't went back to hunt it for a couple years. And the first hunt I threw at it was, I believe, November 9th or 11th. And
were you above, like between the bed and the field? Were you slightly higher, like where that transition of, you talked about, like, you know, those different types of trees, the hedge trees and stuff? Were you just above that bed? Were you off to the side? Where did you end up picking your spot to hang that stand?
So I was up like right before it starts to slope off, so I can shoot down the hill, but also shoot up onto the top.
Gotcha.
And so I go in there with what was it? Yeah, it was a hang and bang setup. So I went in there with my mobile setup, and I set up in that same tree, the same hedge tree that I had my other tree stand in. I went in there, I set up, and right at first light, I hear grunting, chasing, grunting and chasing. And I'm going to get to a good point here with one of the biggest lessons that I learned. Like, I learned multiple different lessons from this one bedding area that have really helped me in every other aspect of when I'm hunting. So all of a sudden I hear grunting, and I have a doe come by me, and then a buck is trailing right behind her. And the doe was there, and they were upwind of me, but down a hill. And this is right at first light. Well, they knew something wasn't right and snorted and took off out of there. And I never understood that until I really, really started to understand thermals. Was that those thermals are dropping in the morning still until that sunlight takes over. So even though I had the wind in my face, my thermals were sucking it right back down towards them. And so I was dumbfounded at how they even knew that I was there. But that was one of, in this bedding area. I learned another one in a different way. But one of my biggest lessons in thermals right there was the wind can be right, but if the thermals are dropping down that hill, nothing's going to save you unless it's a hard enough wind. You know what I mean?
That's a great example of like seeing it firsthand to really understand it, because you can hear about it, but until that really happens for a lot of people, like it just doesn't really make sense. Well, the wind's blowing this way. How in the hell could they smell me? But that I've had that happen to me many, many times. And I think in my intro for this podcast, I talked a little bit about, growth mindset versus fixed mindset and wanting to better yourself and reflection and how that's an important part of the process. And I've had friends do this and talk to people who have been in situations like that and just gone, oh, I don't know what boogered them, and not really thought about it. But the fact that you just have that brain with your engineering of products, but you like analyze why the hell did they bust, even though they were upwind of me. And that's
Yep.
what gave you that realization. And like that just shows you that as long as you're reflecting on it, you can learn from almost any encounter that you have. So
Yep.
I'm glad you mentioned that. That's a good one. I'm liking this bedding area talk. What else did you learn in there, Brian?
Well, so right behind them, right after they spook off, because I started grunting, or I can't remember exactly what I was doing. Maybe I grunted to them, or maybe I just sat there. But all of a sudden, I hear a snort wheeze right there from where they were just at, and all of a sudden, this Magnum just comes out all puffed up, and I was like, game on. So I draw back and I launch one, and I can't remember if I went just over his back or no. I hit something that shot it over this little thicket that they bed in and landed on the other side of the thicket, but I didn't know that at the time. I thought I might have killed him. Everything happened really quick. It was first light, all that good stuff. So anyway, that whole morning though, I ended up seeing like 11 deer, like 7 bucks. They were running through there all throughout the morning. So it really started to click to me too, that if you get into the right spot in the rut, it can be dynamite too. Up until that point, it was very patchy, and I just thought, you could just kind of sit anywhere, any pinch point, stuff like that. But have to really evaluate if you're sitting in a high probability sit still, even with the rut. So that was kind of another little lesson that I learned from that bedding area.
Looking back on it, sounds like originally you'd called that buck out of there. The 10-pointer came down to your decoy. So in your head, you had to be thinking, buck bedding area, this is where they like to be. And then after that rut hunt, which obviously happened a few years later, do you think that area was still just the buck bedding area that you were seeing the cruising? Or do you think there was does using areas close to there and that's why those bucks were cruising through there?
So I have 2 more. So I have 2 bucks that I killed out of this bedding area that are both at different times and different ways. So so after that it went on, I let me get my bearings here. So
sorry, I goofed you up.
It was no, it's okay. There was a long progression of this bedding area, and after I got after I really started recognizing this as a bedding area, because I'd always heard talks of bedding and bed to food, and I'd always hunted thick areas, but to know that you're in an actual bedding area is really important. And then you can start to figure out how to access it, how to utilize your thermals off of hills, and when to hunt it and when to not hunt it, stuff like that. So morning, evening, things like that. So October 15th, 2015-ish, something like that. I actually went, so if you go off of this down into this bottom to the point where it opens up, the mouth of it feeds out into a CRP field, or a big, overgrown, clear cut down in the bottom. And there was a primary scrape down in there too, which I didn't know that's what it was at the time. But I had set up down at the mouth of this opening that morning because I was just worried about thermals, and I still didn't have a full understanding. And so I wanted to be down where it was more open and that wind could seem to be more steady up there, or down there, excuse me. And I remember sitting there glassing, and I saw 2 bucks bounding through the CRP. It was a really nice 10, but it had a broken off side. And then the other one was like a big 8. And they make their way up into that bedding area on the downwind slope of it. Okay. And I remember sitting there thinking, oh, they're going to come down and hit this scrape, but they stayed up in that security cover. And my thought was that they bedded down up in there when I finally left. And I was like, what I'm going to do is I'm going to sneak up the drainage the other way and pop up at the top of that shelf instead of just coming straight up the top. I'm going to pop up. I have a north wind, and it's going to blow my scent straight over my back. And so that night, that's exactly what I did. I snuck up in there, and I actually made some noise, and I thought I would have spooked everything out of there. But that one deer with the broken rack was bedded down in there, and I saw him get up and start sparring with a littler buck. I throw out a grunt. He comes right over to me. I pop him, and I recovered him the next morning, and he died. So that was the first deer I killed out of that bedding area. And that was a mid-October hunt, shooting a buck coming out of his bed off of that point. But usually, like the way that I end up hunting it now, because I have never had like a giant buck that's bedded in there consistently. So even though he was a nice buck, he was still like a 3-year-old. So I'll get big bucks in there, but not consistently enough to where I can feel like I can go in there and hunt them. So trying to think here where I was going with that. What's the other deer? Oh, okay. So the point that jets off away from that generally holds does. So I started running cameras in there and started picking up that it really picked up around that time where I had randomly thrown the sit, which was like the 9th, 11th, somewhere in there. When bucks are really cruising, going from doe to doe, checking bedding areas, this thing lights up. Every year between 10 and 2, I can almost consistently guarantee that if I hunt that for 3 days, I'll see multiple bucks and, have a decent shot at a shooter. And so that really opened up my eyes to what a doe bedding area can do during the rut. And that was the first time that I really took note of midday movement too, was from this bedding area.
The 10 and 2 comment is an interesting one because that's hill country. You're talking about elevation. And I've heard Andy May, who's won't tote himself as just a hill country expert, but in a recent podcast I listened to, he said, if you're hunting hill country and you spend enough time between 10 and 2, you're going to see big deer on their feet. So I think that's really interesting. You just made the same exact correlation. And I'm assuming that has to do with the rising thermals and deer being in their bedding areas at that time, and bucks knowing that if they walk this certain line with those currents, they're going to be able to smell everything. I'm not sure.
Yep. So I believe it's a combination of a lot of things you said, is the rising thermals, but also this is the first bedding area, the way that it sets up, that has one of those figure eights that you hear about going into a bedding area, like going along the side of that ridge or coming. So basically the point that I killed that buck off of right here, right? It slopes down, and then there it goes over and goes to a ditch, which is like a saddle that goes over the hill that way. But then when it comes back up, it goes out to that rounded point right there, which is real thick. And that's like your doe bedding thicket right there, right? Well, those deer will cover that upper 2/3 a lot of the times and go in there and then circle around and then come back out. But the big buck that I killed in there came up over the saddle and then made the loop out that way. And the reason I try and stress this is the way that big bucks a lot of the times will move through a bedding area is different than the way that younger or even 3-year-old bucks will move through a bedding area, because he came over that saddle and covered and was able to cover, like cross the trails there. Didn't have to go into the bedding thicket, but was able to smell it and then make his way, because he's trying to cover as much ground as he can, as efficiently as he can, and as safely as he can. And he doesn't feel very safe being out in the wide open. So he's making his way around the corners, and he's not going right into the middle of them unless he feels as though there's a reason to do it. I'm not saying that's always, but on this particular bedding area and that day, the public land redemption buck that I kill, the 2019 one that we talked about the other night, that's the buck I'm talking about. Yep. And when you see him coming through in the middle of the day, 12:35, he knows that there's going to be does in the bedding area. He knows that there's rising thermals, and he knows that the human pressure is the lowest. And so he's coming through there in the middle of the day on a 55-degree and sunny day when you would least expect a big deer to be moving.
Now I gotta stop and make a correlation for any of our listeners. So Brian, you obviously have not heard, we haven't released any of there's just 2 previous episodes, but part of the idea of this dropping pins is to make these connections to help people get better at mature buck hunting. And In the first episode, one of the stories I talked about was midday movement and how mature bucks can sense pressure and use those advantages, which is something you just mentioned. I don't think that's a coincidence. And then in last night's episode, I recorded with two buddies, Tim and Corey, and one of them talked about how truly mature bucks, not your 3-year-olds, but truly mature bucks, rarely use the well-traveled deer trails, but instead go in the places they feel most comfortable. And what you just described, this larger buck going up the hill and crossing these trails to scent check them, was he on a main trail or was he just kind of sticking to the cover and doing his own thing? I got to
Well,
ask.
well, he's coming down a ditch. So he's using ditches like us mature buck hunters use ditches, right? So he's using the ditch and coming down. And so any of the doe trails are crossing into this bedding thicket. Well, he's covering all of those by going down and then coming around the edge of that cover. And then he's going to make his way out and go to the next one, right? Because he already has a route in his mind of what he's about to do. He's going to go check each one and then get back to cover. And so, yeah. So another, to your point, and not necessarily to do with this story, but like inside corners of fields or even clear cuts, a lot of the times, if they see a lot of deer hunters in there in public areas and the deer have been shot at or know that there's danger, I try to steer clear of inside corners, even though the mainstream media will tell you that they're great. They can be, but if bucks have ever been shot at in a place where they get funneled into movement, they start avoiding those types of places.
And that's something that, depending on the area and the terrain that you're hunting and how much pressure there is, like I know the piece that Brian is talking about, and that piece gets pressured like crazy, probably in the last 10, 15 years, more than it's ever been. So I'm assuming that most of those mainstream, your spots you can pick out on a topo map that anybody could scout on their computer, I'm assuming most of those places, the larger, older bucks probably just learn to avoid, like you're saying,
Yep.
like inside corners.
And so if you ever watch a field now, most of the time, the ditch that comes up in the middle of the field is oftentimes where that big, like away from where anybody could get to easily. That's where that big buck's going to enter the field most of the time. Like I always preface with no such thing as always or never. I could say something and then you go out and go, this guy doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. But I'm just talking in generalities, and what I've seen is, and if you think about it from a big buck standpoint, every time he runs into danger, he's conditioning his brain on where to go and where not to go. That's how they get older, right? They learn just like we learn when we're trying to kill them. So once you start watching that big bucks do things differently, and then you accept that just because you're seeing 3-year-olds do something, that's still not solidifying to you that it is something that you want to correlate with chasing truly mature animals on public or pressured ground. Like that's when that's like the light bulb click. Like I killed that deer on October 15th, but he wasn't a truly mature deer. And so I don't go in there and hunt that point all the time because I killed a deer one time on it. You know what I'm saying? Like I'm constantly trying to learn, like, where are my best odds for a mature buck? Not just because I killed a buck off of this point, I'm going to keep going back there like the rat to the feeder. You know what I'm saying?
I do. I think it ties in that comment and what you're just kind of pulling this justification out. Really ties into a comment you made earlier about being a young hunter and watching the Drury videos and the mainstream media. And I think a lot of guys who grew up in that era like us and watching all the hunting content that was produced in the late 90s and early 2000s, where you're seeing these beautifully managed farms and you're seeing deer naturally move through open areas during daylight. I think you mentioned bucks being conditioned, but I think hunters kind of got conditioned to, this is what I'm supposed to do. These are the spots I'm supposed to hunt. When in reality, we started just hunting where we think they should be and not where deer are. Like you have to hunt those mature deer on their terms. You can't hunt because you think that spot should be where they are. And that's something that you've done a really good job of, finding those spots based on your observations of what are they actually doing and where can I actually intercept them, not just, oh, this looks like the spot they should be in, and then praying that one walks by you, which can happen. But once you make that realization that you have to hunt them on their terms where they are in those hard to hunt spots, if the spot's got you scratching your head going, how in the hell am I going to pull this off? You're probably in the right area to intercept a mature buck.
Yeah, and I also think that a lot of the times people think because they're not seeing big bucks that they're not there. But I mean, these big bucks are magicians when it comes to you just not knowing that they exist. And if it wasn't for trail cams, I wouldn't know half of what I know, and I couldn't check myself because there's so many times where you leave an area that you thought was fire, and then a buck comes in a half an hour later because he was just waiting for you to leave. So it's it's way more in depth than people give them credit for. I always think like if you were trying to hunt your Labrador Retriever, like think of how intuitive they are. A lot of times when my wife pulls in way down our street, all of our dogs jump up and know that she's coming way down the street to where they can't hear the car, or maybe they can, but I'm just saying is imagine trying to sneak up on them and they know she's coming from a quarter mile down the road. You know what I mean? So
They've got
imagine
they've got people
imagine
patterned.
they're in a thicket that has kept them alive for 4 or 5, 6 years, and they don't have to read books and podcasts on how to use thermals and winds to their advantage. They just naturally know. So it's something that we are trying to battle, that they are the master and we're trying to intercept a small portion of their life that we can take advantage of.
I think drawing that conclusion that even like you just said, he's lived 5 years in a thicket or whatever area has made him safe, sanctuary. Like in our brains as hunters, we think about it as in years. But if you think about that deer living 365 days in 1 year and how many times he's picked a bed that has kept him safe and encounters he's had with humans in those 365-day period. I mean, that's a lot of him making decisions that have kept his ass out of the back of a truck.
Well, and
So
even think
yeah,
of, even driving around last night, I saw a lot of good bucks, but I didn't see those magnums, those giants. Even a lot of the times in the summer, they're not that lazy. You know what I mean?
yeah,
Like
yep.
I saw some great bucks last night that I posted in my story, but you just don't see those guys are still a lot of the times in a secluded spot or last light. So you have to wrap your, and oftentimes they're still alone. So I think that's another thing is I think a lot of bucks that make it to maturity oftentimes are loners, as opposed to, you see the 10 and the 8 that are running together for a couple years and stuff like that. And yeah, they can make it, but oftentimes that old dude, he's a loner, man. At least on pressure, because he's learned that if you hang out with the other deer too long, you get shot at. So
Yeah, that's a good correlation. They're so good at figuring out those little nuances. And you were talking before about kind of a situational thing where, setting up or in a spot that's non-conventional, not the normal. And it popped into my head how these deer pick up on those things. There's a story from, I don't know, it's probably like 16 or 17 years old during gun season in Wisconsin. One of the spots up on the national forest that we were hunting, my dad and I had made a ground blind, a bunch of old logs and shit down at the point of a large cedar swamp that went out into a big valley. And what would happen is if we got in there early, pressure from the road and surrounding hunters who would sit on these big hardwood ridges, when they came in, these deer would funnel down into the valley, hit the point of the swamp and take one side or the other and go back into security cover, this big swamp. So we'd kind of be sitting there waiting. And during the week, there was a group of guys that would get together and they used to do these huge deer drives. I mean, they would have like 4 or 5 trucks, guys in the box. They'd have, 40 guys to go push these areas in the big woods, which is very
damn,
difficult to do.
yeah.
But one of the years we were hunting a real nice deer down there, and we went and sat our blind because we knew Wednesday mornings these guys come around and drive and they try to push this swamp. I mean, the swamp is hundreds of acres. You can't push it all, but they're trying to get deer moving. And they had a kid with them who I think was like 13. So he was brand new. They didn't want to drag him through the swamp. So they just put him 100 yards from all their trucks in a parking lot. It's a gravel road. The parking lot comes off. There's a parking spot maybe 80 yards off the main gravel road. They said, you just go sit over here, wait for us. Maybe something will run by you. So they do this drive. It's like a mile-long drive, 40 guys. Boom! Gun goes off right in the beginning of their drive, right up on top of the hill by the cars. They finish out the drive. My dad and I saw some does, maybe like 7 or 8 does squirting out, and they just kind of filtered back around. But we make our way up after about an hour. driver kind of concluded that 13-year-old kid shot a 140-inch buck sitting 100 yards from the car because that was that buck's escape route. He knew that that spot right by the road and the parking lot was not going to see hunting pressure because he had survived multiple seasons smelling where people are. You know, we don't think about night that often, but these deer are walking around at night smelling every spot where hunters sit. They condition themselves. That's a word you just used. These bucks condition themselves to know the areas, just like we get to condition ourselves to know where bucks like. They know where people are going to be. They're not stupid. They've done the dance before. And here he's squirting out right past the trucks. And this time there's a 13-year-old kid sitting there because they didn't want to deal with them. Boom.
How often does that situation play out over all across America? Is that you put the guy in the send off spot, we call it, the gar hole, and he kills the biggest buck because, hey, dummies, where you guys are going to hunt, you've been hunting for the past 10 years. And, one of my best tactics is finding people's tree stands and looking 60, 80 yards on the other side of them, finding the trail that they're using now and setting up on it and, having a decent amount of success. So, but before I forget about it, in that bedding area, a couple years back, I went back in there and I pulled, some all day sits, 10 to 2, really nasty weather. It was like spitting snow, then it'd be sunny, crazy wind, spitting snow, then it'd be sunny. And I had bucks, running that top trail, but I was down in this bottom in that ditch in a different tree, trying to play the wind a little bit different. And when that buck had went into the doe bedding, he didn't come back down by me, and he came back out. So I threw a grunt to him, and he came back down to me, and I got a shot. Now I missed that shot because it was like a 40-yard shot, maybe less. But that's the third time that I had grunted a deer in that bedding area. So if you're in the right spot, calling will work really well. But if you're in a different spot, that they don't assume that bucks might be, or it's not thick enough, which people already know all this stuff. But like that, you're asking things that I learned from this story. Well, that was another one, is like, they are very callable in this particular bedding area because they know there's does, they know there's a high probability of bucks, and they went in there, checked, but now they're like, wait, did I miss something? Did somebody else come in here with a doe or what? You know what I mean? So he had to come all the way down through that thicket just to check, or that, the thick stuff on the hillside. And then
he thought his girlfriend was dabbling with another boyfriend.
So he actually came running. I have video when I grunted, he looks and then he runs and stops about 40 yards and starts scanning down where he can see. But I mean, he's galloping to the grunt call. And so the other thing too, though, is it was like a year before that or after. I get some of the years mixed up, but I went in there and I had a week off and I was going to pull my all day sits in there. Well, I sat there for 2 days straight and all I saw was a button buck. And I checked my camera, and for whatever reason, I don't know if it was pressure or what, there just wasn't anything in there. So I took a day in between that week. It was a Wednesday, and it was going to be really, really windy. So I threw my bow on my back, and I went to this other place. I had put cams in that year, but hadn't really scouted it much other than just running cams. But I hadn't checked the cameras. And so I go on this big loop. I wanted to go all around, and my main objective was to find does. And I get to I found a couple of dead bucks. And as I'm getting back in there, all of a sudden I come to a hub, and I've got does coming down in the bottom, coming off of here. I've got different doe groups. I'm like, this place is loaded up with does. And so I switch and go in there and then have encounter after encounter with bucks, end up killing bucks. And actually that ended up being the bedding area where I eventually killed my booner that you helped me drag out. And so another thing that it taught me is no matter how good that a bedding area is, if it's not happening, it's not happening. You need to assess the situation. You can't just fall in love with a bedding area. You have to keep an open mind, because if I would have just sat there for 5 days, maybe something would have happened. But I didn't even see any does. And so that was what really had me worried, is in a doe bedding area, if you're not seeing does, there's something going on.
Yeah, it's old reliable. It's like it only works if they're there, right? Like you've got to know where your deer are. And just because it's worked in the past, don't bank on it working every year over and over. It can, but
Yep.
like you said, you got to take charge of it and you got to hunt them where they are. If they're not
I,
there, you go find them. That's what you did.
I only have one spot where I've killed two mature bucks. Yeah, like mature bucks in one spot. Every other deer I've ever killed has been different area, jumping around here. And even in that bedding area, they were two different times of year, different trees, different winds, and the mentality was different. One was an evening hunt. Oh, and on that evening hunt in October 15th, where I killed that deer, by the way, in the morning, driving in, started off with a tornado warning that I was going to go hunt in. And it wasn't that bad in the tree, but there I was a little bit worried. And because it was like all across the viewing area, not necessarily just my spot. Like if there was a tornado coming, obviously I would have stayed home. But I'm like, I'm
maybe.
Yeah, right. Like maybe. And so I get up in there, and when I talked about going up, that was also the first time that I'd really used the terrain to my advantage with the wind. As far as thinking I would blow that wind over my back, over the ditch and hunt the top of it. But that was also a time where I learned another lesson about evening thermals, because I climbed up in there thinking I had screwed it up, and because I had made some noise up in there, and I figured I was really close to his bed. That was another lesson I learned, was making sure that all of your shit is quiet and you're really efficient with your system to get up in there. But I get up in there after, I can't remember if something snorted or anything like that, but I was kind of mad at myself. And about a half an hour later, as the thermal started to take over in the evening behind me, where I wanted that wind to blow, a doe snorted right down in the bottom. And I was like, God damn it, the wind is blowing that way. How is it getting to her? You know what I mean? And I was like, well, shit, now that screwed up this even more. I was a bad entrance, or it was like bad getting set up. And then now I have a doe blowing. I'm like, this is screwing me all up. And then that buck stands up, and he was still in there, and I shoot him. What also taught me a lesson, which has happened again, is just because a doe blows does not mean that your hunt is over. I had a buck come in the week that my second daughter was born. It was like 10:30 in the morning, bright sunny day, October 22nd. I'm up high on this ridge in a totally different place. A doe had come in and was stomping and snorting probably like fucking 50 or 100 times. And she circled and then came back around like a half an hour later to come in and stomp and blow again. And then she finally made her way off. And then I'm just sitting there hanging out, just thinking, about going home and seeing the baby and the kids. And I look over, and there's a giant at 20 yards in this thicket. And I throw 2 arrows at him, so excited, and hitting limbs. And I should have waited for a way better shot. And I was like, what in the hell am I doing? It was amateur hour. But again, another lesson learned: when those does blow, that does not mean that the bucks are taking them seriously.
And I've heard plenty of stories of, and I've actually, what I think witnessed is deer will blow at other deer too. Like does will blow at bucks when bucks are pestering them or they don't want to be bothered. That's something that it's a communication tool they use. Yeah, they use it to alert deer of danger, but it's something that's not as uncommon as sometimes we may have thought. We thought it was a game changer. It's going to ruin your hunt. Boom, you're busted. But like there's situations where that just doesn't really, especially during the rut. I think early season, it's different. When they blow, it's usually an alarming, but during the rut, as soon as you hit November, you hear deer blowing, I'd say get ready, because that could be bucks bumping, chasing. It could be any of that.
In a bedding area though, a lot of the times they're so used to does blowing throughout the day at coyotes, maybe a turkey comes in and spooks them. And also that buck was coming back in way late, or maybe I think he was switching his day bed is what he was doing. So he wasn't even necessarily close enough for it to bother him at that point. And then he shifted his bed and came in. So, the takeaway for me was, just because some old doe comes in and starts blowing at you, that's not the first time those deer have heard a deer blow. And also, if the deer is blowing and standing there and stomping and comes back around, the buck's going, well, it must not be too big of a danger, or else she'd be running like immediately, like snorting and blowing, running 100 miles an hour. spiral. She's in there stomping, creating a ruckus because she doesn't know what the hell's going on.
Yeah, that's a good point. All right, Brian, we're coming up on 50 minutes. I got one last question I'll have for you, and then we'll wrap up the podcast here. I'm just curious, this season, do you have any specific goals, things that you're trying to do, something new, something different? We talked a little bit about the areas you're hunting, but you got any goals this season that are kind of pushing you to maybe get outside your comfort zone or try something new?
Like I've talked about, I'm branching out into a lot harder terrain for me because it's not all of it is flat ground, but it's much flatter than what I'm used to. And I feel like those hills are a cheat code because of like what I've talked about with being able to go up drainages and pop up right there in their bedding and stuff like that, or use, creek systems and things like that. But a lot of this stuff that I have picked out is going to be like life or death getting in there, because it's very open, it's very flat, and they're going to be able to see you and hear you from a lot farther away. And I'm not going to be able to use the thermals. I mean, I'll still be able to use the thermals, but not in the ways that I like to use them, to like dump my set. Yeah. So, and also I'm going to be hunting around a lot more water, like actual water sources, and just seeing how all of that is going to play into it. Like I was in a flat river bottom yesterday, and it really has me perplexed because I followed deer tracks and what I think was a big deer, whether it was a doe or a buck, and multiple deer on this line miles back in there. And in my brain, I'm like, well, they're hanging out close to the fields, right? And it doesn't seem like there's any one defined bedding area. So it's just me trying to wrap my head around new terrains and trying because like right now my brain is like searching for anything that it can to draw conclusions. And until you get in there and hunt, and I'm running cameras. I did my scouting, then I'm running my cameras. Postseason, I'm in there. I'm scouting in season. I'm seeing deer on the hoof. But until you get in there and throw a couple sits, couple seasons, it's really hard to draw a conclusion on an area. So, the other thing too is this is the first year that I've ever utilized water holes for camera locations, and so far, it's been pretty awesome just getting in there and seeing them respond to not respond, but just basically me getting outside of what I usually do with just scrapes and travel corridors out of bedding and still seeing some positive results.
I'm really excited to see how your season goes with trying a totally different style of terrain. I think you're going to get onto some deer for sure, because that's just how your brain works. You're going to work tirelessly till you figure it out. But I'd love to get you back on after season sometime in the winter or spring and see what conclusions you've drawn just from this one season of trying out new things. Obviously, you're already getting some takeaways with your trail camera stuff on the water holes, but I'd love to talk to you again and just see what you've learned about this flatter terrain.
Hopefully I'm not dragging my tail between my legs and telling you, you know what, I'm going back to hill country. those guys can have all that other shit, apparently. You know what I mean? So,
well, we'll get you back into the hill country at least one time here. I'll be heading down to the hill country so you can drag my buck out. So we'll get you in those hills at least once.
And again, guys that are listening to this, I know that mine is not true hill country. Hill country is like big woods, large hills, even mountainous. I just call it hill country because they're big hills to me. So,
well, no, it's the same correlation when you have thermals, cuts, draws.
Right.
It's very much the same style. It's just the scale of hills, right? Every place is different. You don't get to decide that.
And my understanding, and this is without me being there, is that when you have larger hills, they have different levels that they can bed at. So figuring out where those deer are bedding based off of pressure or cover or thermals or benches and stuff like that is going to be different, because my upper 2/3 is not that hard to figure out on that hill, right? It's pretty simple. They can only run a certain part of that hill. You can't always cover all of the hill, but you can get a pretty good idea of how those bucks are going to use it most of the time if you know what you're doing.
Heck yeah, man. Well, we appreciate your knowledge today. Folks who are listening, I'm sure you probably heard Brian on a plethora of other podcasts. If you haven't already, go check out his YouTube, Good Sit Mobile. If you're looking for some good products for self-filming or for hanging trail cams, check out goodsitmobile.com. His videos, obviously, you can learn a lot from. They're visual stories. If you're a visual learner like me, check those out. But Brian, thanks a lot for hanging out in the mobile podcast studio there in your garage. I appreciate you coming on this morning and dropping some knowledge for us. It's a pleasure as always, my friend.
Hey, buddy, pleasure's all on this side, so I appreciate it.
All right, we'll be in touch for the trip down when I come visit you. Otherwise, that'll end this episode of Dropping Pins. I hope you guys had some insights and some learning moments that you could drop from Brian. So thank you very much. Have a good one.
Bye, guys.